the whole thing started really when I was young, like I said, and I was in elementary school. We were living in Florida, and I had a teacher. I believe it was the fifth grade, um, and the teacher would make us every day before we left school sing Jingle Bells in Spanish. I remember that, and his name was Mr. Freeman. And the one thing that he always wanted us to do is to learn that song and learn about history because he was a history teacher. And I remember whenever I left the fourth grade to go into the fifth grade, yeah, it was the fifth grade, everybody used to have these horrible stories because he was this, big black guy and he was mean and everything. And if you got out of line with him, he would be so awful to you and stuff like that. And whenever I finally got into his class, I mean, it was just like completely amazing. He was completely the opposite of what people had told me about him. And I think that's probably one of the first times where I've actually gotten inspired. I might have gotten a little bit inspired before that in fourth grade, but in the fifth grade, that's where I had to do my book reports, where I just mentioned it about I did Ponce de Leon and how he discovered Florida, and then George Washington. And I was living in Florida too, by the way, when that was going on. So that's one of the reasons why my book report was on Ponce de Leon and the Fountain of Youth and stuff like that. And mind you too, I was interested in all that stuff, and I didn't watch Indiana Jones until I was in my teens, you know what I mean? And this was back whenever I was in the fifth grade. So, and I'll say it again too, I mean, I wasn't a good student at all. I didn't make A's, I didn't make B's. I was a failing student, to be honest with you. I'd make A's maybe in PE, something that was easy because I was a skinny little guy who was very active, had no problems with doing exercises and stuff, but I wasn't very good at schoolwork whatsoever. I was actually a bad student more than like a bad student. I wasn't really. I was like I like to cause trouble more than I did anything else. But the one thing that I can say though is I loved history. I might have played it off in school like I didn't, but when it came down to it, I mean, I would go home and I'd read the textbooks and stuff because I wanted to learn about history and the stories that were inside of it. And that just continued all through my life, even during the times after I dropped out of school. And because I dropped out of school actually at a very early age. I made it to the 8th grade and dropped out in 8th grade. I never even made it to high school. So when even after that though, I was always, reading about history, getting information about history and stuff like that. So it's been something that's been there all my life. I didn't start really getting into the full-blown aspect of educating myself until later in my life. Don't get me wrong, it's not like I was always doing that, because there was a time of a huge time gap in my life where I didn't, try to educate myself. And it took me until I was in my late 30s, or just going into my 40s, before I finally figured out that, I'm only hurting myself. It doesn't matter if I'm in school or if I'm not in school. If I'm not learning something, then there's something wrong. and if I want to have a better life, then I need to constantly be putting myself in check so that I was learning something. And the thing about even those times, I mean, I was one of those kids and young adults above 18 and 20 and all that who got hooked into the wrong crowds, did the drugs, the alcohol, stuff like that. I'm 50 years old now, and I can safely say, that I was on a downhill, you know what I mean? And but while I was doing that, I was always doing the history thing, and it would come up in conversations, and people would say, "How is it that you know that stuff?" And I was like, "I don't know. I just read." That was always my big explanation for it. So I got into history. Don't get me wrong. I didn't get into like ancient history until these years in my 30s and 40s, up into my 50 years old, until this time period. But I was always interested in American history. I was interested in European history, things of that nature. Everything going back to Rome. I like the Byzantine Empire, but I wasn't aware of the Persians or the Assyrians or the Sumerians. Those were alien to me for the longest time. I've heard of them, you know what I mean, but I didn't really know about them. I dabbled a little bit with the Egyptians, but not very much. Every time I got into the Egyptians, it was usually had something to do with Aleister Crowley or some kind of witchcraft stuff. Like I was one of those 17-year-olds who believed in the Necronomicon. You know what I mean? And I didn't realize until I was about 23 that was just a fake book, and there was nothing real about it. But I was one of those kids. But anyhow, getting into that area too, I don't want people to misunderstand it at all either. Like when it comes to like ancient astronauts, yeah, I got into that. I did a full blown. I started getting curious in a lot of the ancient history because of stuff like ancient astronauts, and going in and researching Zechariah Sitchin, and finding out if what he was saying was actually true or not. And in the end, it didn't really matter to me because of the information that I'd learned from starting out with him, you know what I mean? Because I went from looking for lost civilizations or proof of lost civilizations to aliens, the Anunnaki and all that stuff, to I went from there to learning about these cultures who sprung up out of nowhere, basically in the middle of a desert, created houses out of mud, learned how to create crops and stuff, and then how they ended up migrating. I started learning about the Sumerians and their gods and their lore, and it went from there into the Egyptians. I started getting back into the Egyptians and taking it serious and learning about the Amtuat, which I've made posts about on my videos. But I do want to go further in the Egyptians too, because I know there's a lot more that I need to check out on there. But the Sumerians are the ones that I first caught on to and got interested in. I turned around and I went from the Sumerians into the Urartu, and then the Turkish, which back then it wasn't Turkey, it was just the Urartu, which is up around Armenia, I believe it is. Yeah, Armenia. And then there was the Hittites, you know what I mean? And that was something that really just amazed me, because then I started learning about what, like a lot of people with Zachariah Sitchin, they don't understand his writing, and they say that all of the stuff that he wrote about the Sumerians were false. And I found out later on that the reason why they felt that way was because they were reading the wrong text. Zachariah Sitchin was taking a lot of the information that he got from the Phoenicians, and during his time he had mixed the Phoenicians up with the Hittites, so he believed that he was reading stuff from the Hittites, which weren't the Hittites. It was actually old Phoenician writings. And I learned all that because of, research and finding out for myself and listening to old interviews and stuff. And even through that whole process, none of the stuff was, all aliens from outer space and stuff, but it was amazing because they did believe in giants, you know what I mean? The Hittites, the Urartu, the Phoenicians, all of them believed in it. And I ended up having issues with the Greeks, because I started finding out that with history, most of my life and most of everybody's lifetime, we've been brought up on this Western philosophy that rotates around the Greek and Greek history. Everything seems to stem from them, and in our educational system, we aren't introduced to the Persians, you know what I mean, and their culture, and then what they believed in. It took me until I got into my 30s to finally realize that the Persians were the first empire to actually believe in freedom. They abolished slavery, They just didn't believe in it. I hear some scholars try to beat around the bush and say, oh, but some of them had slaves. And I was like, I've been reading the papers, okay? And there's never a place in there that mentions that the Persians ever owned any kind of slaves. And then I started learning about the Zoroastrians, and then about oh gosh, I forgot the name of the religion they had above them. It was up around it was the Indo-Europeans, or the they're the ones that had it. It was like Mitzvah or something like that. I don't want to get into a history lesson, but later on I'll pull it up and make a thing about it. But it all that stuff started coming to or I started learning about it, and I really liked it. And I started learning about, these cultures that formed